Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be over the most recent occurrence of events around that of the super welterweight or the junior middleweight division at 154 pounds. Now, of course, for those of you that ended up watching the card last weekend, that on Saturday night on March 30th, of course, there was the main event between that of Tim Tszyu and also that of Sebastian Fundora. Of course, originally supposed to be Keith Thurman facing that of Tim Tszyu, but of course, Keith Thurman, he ends up getting an injury every 5 seconds. But it is what it is. Anyways, of course, it ended up being a good little fight. Sebastian Fundora, of course, is able to pull off the upset, according to some people, and he was able to get the victory. Now, of course, was that probably somewhat due to the unfortunate cut that Tim Tszyu ended up sustaining over his head that was leaking in his face the whole entire time? That was caused by an elbow, yes. And of course, some would debate that maybe that fight should have been stopped after a certain amount of rounds and went to the scorecards. But, it is what it is. Fundora ended up winning the fight. And of course, now the conversation is what fights are going to occur possibly next? Well, apparently Sebastian Fundora and also Tim Tszyu's manager, when they were possibly in the position to face out of Terence Bud Crawford, they state that they may not actually go the Terence Bud Crawford route at all, at least not at the moment. But that Fundora, overall, that he very well could potentially fight that of Errol Spence Jr. next. And to be honest with you, just in my personal view, I don't really blame Fundora's side for going after that of Errol Spence Jr. Now, a certain amount of people might, look at me and state, why would you necessarily state that? Because Terence Bud Crawford proved that he, of course, was the better fighter between the two, out of himself and Errol Spence Jr., and Fundora, of course, was able to just become somewhat of the unified champion at 154 pounds. Why would we not want to see the Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr., the Terence Bud Crawford versus Sebastian Fundora fight? And even though, of course, I would love to see that fight because, of course, it would be a fight between two somewhat unified champions. At the end of the day, I can understand Sebastian Fundora's side because Errol Spence Jr., if they were to make that fight in Dallas, which apparently is their plan, I do believe that more than likely they will probably make a bigger payday than that of what the Terence Bud Crawford, fight would be and that of Dallas. Now, I could be wrong. But the truth of the matter is about Terence Bud Crawford, even though he's a phenomenal fighter, and I'm not stating overall that Fundora, of course, should duck or avoid Terence Bud Crawford, but I can't necessarily blame Fundora nor blame his manager for stating that they would prefer probably overall to fight that of Errol Spence Jr. next. Errol Spence Jr., even, of course, after his ass whooping against Terence Bud Crawford, he's still somewhat of a credible opponent. He probably is still, at least on my list, one of the top 20 pound-for-pound fighters in all of boxing. I don't think I can have him in my top 10 anymore, but, he's a guy that still probably is one of the top fighters out there, and a guy to where a lot of people would probably pay to see that fight. And to be honest with you, and some people might disagree, there's a possibility that a Fundora versus Errol Spence Jr. fight might draw a little bit more intrigue than that of a Terence Bud Crawford versus Fundora fight. And if we're also going to be real about Mr. Terence Bud Crawford here, now, of course, after defeating Errol Spence Jr. in the way that he did, I'm sure that he also gained a certain amount of more followers or a certain amount of more viewers to his next fights. But Terence Crawford, when we just talk about him, he's never really been one of the main faces of boxing. And when I say faces of boxing, I'm not talking about one of the top elite pound-for-pound fighters. I'm not talking about debatably the best all-around fighter in boxing. All I'm talking about is in terms of a marketability standpoint, Terence Bud Crawford has some fights that get very decent views, especially if they're free on ESPN. But in terms of real pay-per-view buys, all of his pay-per-views pretty much have underwhelmed. It just is what it is. Even the Errol Spence Jr. one, that fight was expected to be the quote-unquote fight of the decade, and I believe it only did around 800,000 pay-per-view buys. So once again, Terence Bud Crawford, he's a guy to where, it's going to be very interesting to see where he goes next because he could try to unify 154. He could try to stay at welterweight, but of course you have Duran Bucenas there. Is that really a guy that you would want to majorly face right now? I'm not quite so sure about that, when it comes down to it, and of course he has the options at 154. So the question is that, would you really want to put your fighter in there with Terence Bud Crawford immediately, at least before that of an Errol Spence Jr. fight? Because Crawford's a guy to where he's a guy to where he's notable, but he's not a guy, once again, to where he's going to give you as massive of a payday potentially as in other areas. And, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but Errol Spence, of course, would be a great option because that's a fight to where Errol Spence is a little bit vulnerable right now because of his most recent loss, but it would still be counted as a great A-grade win. And on top of that, you might get a potential bigger payday, especially if that fight is held in Dallas. So I can't really blame that, because Crawford is a dude, once again, to where potentially the payday is not going to be big enough. And that dude is a potential career ender. Like, Terence Bud Crawford is pretty much ending people's careers. He ended Sean Porter's career. I'm not going to say that Errol Spence's, career is over as of yet, but, I'm not really sure how much more time he has left. I mean, I'm sure that put a few more years on his career after that ass whooping that he took. Of course, he ended Gamboa's career pretty much, because he was never the same after that. And he ended some other guys' career as well. So Terence Crawford is a bad dude. But the question is, of course, are they going to potentially take that fight? Well, Dante's Boxing Nation is going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
What? Oh, shit. Hey, everybody know Team Crawford. Y'all know I get active. Let's go.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So Andre Ward, he recently did an interview, and he was asked if you could just name about 3 fighters that you feel are built like you, that just wants all the smoke. They're willing to move up in weight, whatever it takes, to show that they're the best. What fighters would you say are built like that today? And Andre Ward, he said, man, honestly, I could only say one right now. I can only say one. He said there may be more than one, but for sure, I can only say one, and that's Terence Crawford. Guys, I am telling you right.
Well, let me also state this very quickly. And let me also address something with Andre Ward, because whenever it comes to narratives, especially about all-time great fighters, with someone potentially avoiding fighters throughout their career, I always usually hear it with 3 fighters, or maybe even 4. I hear it with Canelo Alvarez, I hear it with Floyd Mayweather Jr., and I hear it with Andre SOG Ward, and also at times Tyson Fury. But let me tell you this about all those fighters. In my view, they're all-time great fighters. Now, of course, I have a lot of people in my comment section stating that, oh, Canelo is avoiding a lot of names. He just fights guys at the weakest. I've already went through that. And if you want to see my video about that, I reviewed a Boxing Ego video, I believe either about a week ago or, maybe several days back. I can't remember when. It was about the Andre SOG Ward conversation. And I went through Canelo's resume to prove that that's pretty much more narrative than what it is actual fact. Canelo has a great resume. I've heard it, of course, about that of Floyd Mayweather. And you can state maybe about Mayweather and Canelo that, maybe at certain points in their, fights that maybe those guys had already suffered losses, or maybe that they weren't absolutely at the peak of their powers at times, like maybe when Mayweather fought De La Hoya or Judah or something else like that. But they pretty much were A-grade level fighters, So once again, that needs to be addressed. Mayweather and Canelo, both in my view, are A-grade level fighters and all-time greats, in my personal view. Floyd would be probably within my top 10 of all time. And once you get within that top 10 of all time, you can have a great debate about debatably being the greatest fighter ever. So Floyd, in my view, is in that class. Canelo is probably somewhere within my top 20 to top 30 of all time. Certainly within my top 30 to top 35. Somewhere around there. Top 20, he might also be there, but I would have to check and really do a rank list. As of Andre SOG Ward, he's probably maybe either slightly under Canelo Alvarez just because in terms of accomplishments and, or maybe he's around the same level. But let me also address this, because Andre SOG Ward, I get a lot of people that state that, oh, Andre Ward, he avoided Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev, and he retired on purpose to avoid them. Well, let me give Andre SOG Ward credit. And I'm not maybe stating that maybe Andre didn't see those guys as threats, maybe, I don't know. But I'm not going to go as far to state that Andre SOG Ward ducked those guys, because he fought Sergey the Crusher Kovalev overall. And he was looked at as the best light heavyweight and the most dangerous light heavyweight of that time. Now, if maybe you want to say that Andre SOG Ward could have stayed around and fought Adonis Stevenson and go for, unification, and then fought Bivol and Beterbiev, I mean, you can argue that if you want to, but I don't really hold that too much against Andre SOG Ward, because he pretty much proved everything that he needed to at 168 by beating Frosch and Mikhail Kessler and some of those other guys. Of course, he brought Chad Dawson down a weight class, but, still beat a decent fighter. And then, of course, he defeated Sergey the Crusher Kovalev at the light heavyweight class. So I'm not really going to criticize those fighters way too much. But in terms of this narrative of fighters just willing to fight anybody at any time, especially in terms of boxing, that's never really happened with anybody in the history of boxing. And I know that a lot of people are going to heavily disagree with that, but no one, especially in boxing, because of how finicky your paycheck and your money can be, especially after losing a certain fight, there's this narrative around that fighters are basically willing to just fight every single buddy in their career at any particular time. And, oh, it's not that age anymore. You can state that it's a little bit more finicky today, or that people are a little bit more protective of their money today, especially ever since Floyd Mayweather Jr. and his blueprint. But to state that, these fighters, they just always fight the best. At the end of the day, it's like Andre SOG Ward could have stayed around and potentially fought Adonis Stevenson, but he did not. All right, when it comes down to it, when you talk about Canelo, Canelo could have potentially fought Demetrius Bubu Andrade. He could have potentially fought Gennady Golovkin earlier. And of course, he could be trying to push this David Benavidez fight a little bit more. Of course, he didn't really do that, even though, of course, he's still accomplished a great amount in his career. As for Floyd Mayweather Jr., Floyd Mayweather Jr. also could have fought potentially some other fights. Or, he could have fought that at Keith Thurman. And what did he tell Keith? He said, well, fight Errol Spence Jr. first, because that's something that Floyd Mayweather Jr. does, as well as a little bit of Canelo and some other elite fighters, where they state that if you want to fight me, then beat this other elite guy, so it makes it worth my while. So this is nothing new. But once again, this narrative of that, these guys want to fight everybody, the best of the best at all times, that's not boxing. And that's never really been the case. And Terence Bud Crawford doesn't do that either. And I'm not stating that he does not fight some of the best, but to just state that he's willing to basically give everyone a chance, whoever seems the most dangerous. Well, if that were true right now, he'd be fighting Jerome Boots Ennis and not even be looking at the 154-pound weight class. So at the end of the day, Dante can try to push this narrative about how Terence is always fighting the best of the best and, no one else is doing it, like him. But at the end of the day, if that were true, Terence Bud Crawford right now would be fighting Jerome Boots Ennis. And I don't go against Crawford for not fighting Jerome Boots Ennis, because at the end of the day, he's a very big threat. He's a guy that right now is not too established of a fighter. He just ended up getting a belt because it was vacated by Crawford. He's a humongous threat. He's very young. And on top of that, you may not get a major payday against him overall like you would in some other areas. So why would you really want to fight that guy? So I don't really have a problem overall with Crawford not fighting Jerome Boots Ennis. But then you can't get after certain other fighters for maybe not wanting to fight another fighter overall if they believe that they can get a bigger payday or something overall in terms of legacy points more elsewhere. But Dante, of course, is not going to keep those standards because, like I've always stated, Dante's Boxing Nation is very racially motivated. And let me also state this, because I also get a certain amount of people that state, on my video yesterday when I did the Gervonta Tank Davis video, I had one person, I believe, in my comment section who respectfully commented, by the way, had nothing, personal against that comment. It was a valid question where he stated that, well, I personally disagree with you. Because, Dante gave Inoue credit and, to state that, he doesn't like non-black fighters. I don't think that that's correct. Well, if we're going to go into that, you would then have to explain to me why Dante's Boxing Nation is always on the ass of Tyson Fury, Canelo Alvarez, Alexander Usyk, Vasily Lomachenko, Naoya Inoue, whether they're ranked potentially as the number one pound-for-pound fighter or when they potentially don't want a big fight and he has the energy of them ducking a fighter. But then when it comes to certain black fighters, like Gervonta Tank Davis, not taking any big fights in his career, at least against the real creme de la creme crop, there's no conversation about it, or he treats him with kid gloves. When it came down to overall, I believe Terence Bud Crawford stating that he didn't want to fight Sean Porter at that one point in time, he basically made excuses. Terence Crawford right now doesn't want to fight Jerome Boots Ennis, and there's no criticism for Terence Bud Crawford. So, like I stated, you would have to tell me that. You would also have to tell me why these guys had such a problem with Inoue getting Fighter of the Year over Terence Bud Crawford last year. Sure, Terence Crawford probably got the biggest win of the year over Errol Spence, but according to them, Stephon Coolboy Fulton was a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. And Terence Crawford and Inoue were just as dominant as each other. Inoue beat two more champions than what Crawford did within those 12 months of a span. He won in two separate weight classes and was undisputed in two separate weight classes within that 12-month span and knocked every single one of his opponents out, just like Terence Bud Crawford. So once again, why did they have this huge problem with Inoue being ranked Fighter of the Year, even though he accomplished more than Crawford within that 12-month span? And on top of that, he beat a guy that on their list was top 10 pound per pound. And then on top of that, they didn't have a problem with Devin Haney being also Fighter of the Year potentially. Why is that?
Now, after the boxing world seeing what Crawford did to Errol Spence, the majority of boxers, they said to themselves, thank God that man is not in my weight division. And now that Terence Crawford is moving up to 154 at 36 years old and naturally the smaller guy, and you still have fighters that are not in too much of a hurry to get in the ring with him. Sebastian Fundora's promoter.
Terence Crawford is one of those fighters to where you know, because he's because he's so talented, but on top of that, because you're not going to get as much of a massive payday to fight him, it's almost like I'm not going to state that it's impossible for him to get big fights. I'm not going to state that because he's gotten some big fights. But fighters aren't just going to be running overall to the finish line to fight that a Terence Crawford unless you're very young and hungry and you're willing to prove yourself, like a Duran Butsenis or, you know, maybe someone of that ilk. You know, someone that wants to be remembered as the new best of their generation to topple off that Lion of the Pride or that old king. You know, but at the end of the day, it's like a lot of these fighters are not going to be rushing to the table to fight that a Terence Crawford. They're just not going to be.
Was very honest. He recently came out, did an interview, and he said that Errol Spence is the easier fight.
Like Crawford, if I were actually going to compare him, he's almost like a Vasily Lomachenko. To where Lomachenko, you know, people were calling Lomachenko out, but like not every single fighter was absolutely rushing to fight Vasily Lomachenko. Like when Vasily Lomachenko called out Mikey Garcia was scared to death of that man. And Gervonta Tank Davis, Vasily Lomachenko was calling out Gervonta Tank Davis forever. And every single time that Lomachenko was brought up, Gervonta Tank Davis would shit on the floor. I mean, you know, so once again, you know, the LDBC and the media, what they'll have you believe is that Lomachenko was avoiding all these fighters. No, the only fighter that Lomachenko really, at least somewhat avoided, because I think that he thought that he was a little bit of a threat and too little of a reward at the time, was that of Devin Haney.
And he said they want to make Crawford wait, maybe 1 or 2 fights. Crawford wait, maybe 1 or 2 fights.
I need we get the rematch, but not in this moment. Now I need to maximize the most money for the fighter. I believe he deserves it.
Is that Errol Spence Jr.?
That's correct.
Over Crawford? Like, did Spence more money? Or?
No, Crawford, we're not sell out 90,000 people in Dallas. I can tell you that much.
Is Crawford the best?
I agree with that. And once again, a certain amount of these promoters, once again, they look at Terence Crawford as a humongous threat. And on top of that, he's just not as big of a sell as what people try to make him out to be or what his fans try to make him out to be. Crawford is a great fighter. He's an all-time great fighter. And, you know, once again, he's not the worst seller that I've ever seen. But in terms of a boxing, you know, pound-for-pound star, at least someone overall that's supposed to be an alleged pay-per-view star, he might be the worst pay-per-view seller that I've at least seen overall, probably within that of recent boxing. I mean, I can name you overall probably 5 to 10 fighters, you know, within my lifetime that were better pay-per-view draws than that of Terence Crawford. Canelo, certainly. Errol Spence Jr., Tyson Fury, when it comes down to it, at least, you know, somewhat within his bigger fights. You know, one may even debate Gennady Triple G Golovkin, you know, Gervonta Tank Davis, certainly. You know, and there might be some other fighters that, you know, personally I'm not mentioning at the moment. I'm kind of drawing a blank. You know, Floyd Mayweather, of course, Manny Pacquiao. You know, even though I kind of caught them a little bit towards the end of their career. You know, hell, even Miguel Cotto. I mean, Terence Crawford, once again, he's not a massive pay-per-view seller. He's just not.
Fighter that
yes, but you know, like everybody wait, like Benavides wait. Why not Crawford? Let him wait one time or maybe twice, and then he go.
Even with Spence, you know, losing the fight, Crawford beating, you still think the value's better on Spence?
But in the end of the day, is maximize the profit for the fighter, and it'd be stupidity for me not to do that for him.
So safer for Spence.
I would agree with that. And, you know, the guy also mentioned after that it's safer for Spence. Not only is it safer for Spence, but it's just a safer option all in general. Of course, Fundora has the potential to beat that of Errol Spence Jr., but, you know, on top of that, like Errol Spence, he's just going to be worth more money than Terence Crawford, especially with the fight in Dallas. I mean, Terence Crawford, I mean, you can try to, you know, sell that fight, and it of course would sell because Crawford is looked at as, you know, potentially right now the best fighter in the world. Right now, he would be my number 1 pound-for-pound pick. He'd be my number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. But, you know, just because you win a certain amount of fights, or even if you're looked at as the best fighter in the world, that doesn't always make you a big pay-per-view draw. And that's what a certain amount of people don't understand. Right now, the main face of boxing, the 2 main faces of boxing right now, you know, whichever order you put them in. Right now, I'd probably have Canelo at 1 and Gervonta Tank Davis at 2. But Canelo right now would be number 1, and he probably would be at number 3 or number 4 on my pound-for-pound list right now, or anywhere from number 2 to number 4. Of course, you could also put him at number 1 debatably, you know, but I put him a little bit lower just because he hasn't been looking quite as dominant as of late. But, we'll see what happens. And then, of course, Gervonta Tank Davis, and he's not even on my personal top 10 pound-for-pound list. So once again, marketability is not always about what big fights you win. It's just overall your fan base and what overall attraction that you have with certain fans, and what you bring to the table. And Crawford, in terms of, boxing aficionados, he's an excellent watch. He's a guy to where he's an all-time great talent and an all-time great fighter for sure. But he's just never been that big of a draw.
Say that boxing is business, as Mayweather and everyone.
Yeah, Samson is right. Boxing is a business. And when people say boxing is a business, what they really mean is losing is bad for business. Now, first of all,
yes, it's bad for business. And on top of that, he's taking a look at it and saying, why the hell would I want to fight Terence Bud Crawford next or match him against Terence Bud Crawford next? And Crawford is a very dangerous dude. But on top of that, Crawford has never been this big pay-per-view draw. We could make a ton of money against Errol Spence Jr. Overall, have a little bit of that unification battle there. A lot of people would tune in to potentially see if Errol Spence Jr. can make a comeback. He would have a great amount of fans there. We can make it in Dallas. There's going to be Errol Spence Jr. fans there. The hometown native boy of Dallas. And then on top of that, we have Sebastian Fundora. I believe that he's Mexican-American, and of course there's a big Latino and especially Mexican fan base around there. We could do millions with that. And of course they'd still do millions with Terence Bud Crawford, but I think that also I agree that in terms of a sell, that it might be a little bit easier with Errol Spence Jr.
It's a terrible example to use Floyd Mayweather. Because for those of you guys who don't know, when Floyd Mayweather was in this...
Well, it's not really a terrible example to use Floyd Mayweather Jr. because Mayweather Jr. also did certain things to build up certain fights. What DontaesBoxingNation wants you to believe is that Floyd Mayweather Jr. never did what Canelo Alvarez or what some of these other fighters are doing, and that's just not the case. At the end of the day, and that's not me stating that Floyd Mayweather ducked a whole lot of fighters or anything like that, but Floyd, at times, once again, when Canelo Alvarez and him, when it was about to happen, Floyd didn't just say, okay, Canelo, you know what? You have a belt there, so let's get in the ring. You look like one of the top fighters. What did he state to Canelo? He said, you know what? If you're going to get in a fight with me, get in a fight with Austin Trout because we have to market this fight a little bit. And on top of that, I need you to prove to me that it's going to be worth my while. And then Keith Thurman, of course, called out Floyd Mayweather, and he said, well, if you want to fight me, then you fight Errol Spence Jr. And, of course, Keith Thurman declined. So, once again, when people always tell you this shit about, oh, this guy doesn't duck no smoke, listen, there's certain fighters overall that fight better competition more consistently than others, like Canelo, like Mayweather, like Pacquiao, and, Crawford tries, but I still think his resume is kind of lacking a little bit compared to other all-time great fighters. And there's other fighters like Errol Spence, Fury, certain guys that do that, but at the end of the day, it's like, this narrative of that, oh, well, what happened to those fighters that, just fought every single guy that they could, and always fought the best of the best. That's never happened in boxing. Even Muhammad Ali, at one point in time, when he was having a shit time or a troubling time with Ken Norton, he went to George Foreman, who I believe was retired, and he said, hey, listen, dude, if you end up defeating this guy, I'll give you a rematch. Because he didn't want to fight that guy. And that's on record.
Early 20s. Floyd Mayweather was the boogeyman in his division. He had everyone avoiding him. He was like Devin Haney back then. Floyd had Nassim Hamed avoiding him. He had Acelino Popo Freitas avoiding him. Joel Casa.
I don't even remember that fucking name. But I remember Nassim Hamed. And Prince Nassim Hamed, a very talented athlete, but a guy that... I might have to do a video on him one day. Very talented fighter, but a dude that was pure athleticism, and he had boxing skills, but very defensively flawed fighter.
Mayor, he called out Costa Zoo. And only reason that fight didn't happen because Ricky Hatton ended up beating Costa Zoo before Floyd Mayweather could get the fight.
And of course, at one point in time, Floyd Mayweather Jr. also called out Sugar Shane Mosley. And Sugar Shane Mosley turned it down, I believe, a couple of times, but at that time it also made sense. Like Sugar Shane Mosley, a lot of people don't talk about it, but he turned down the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight at one time because he was going up to fight Oscar De La Hoya, and that was going to be a much bigger payday, a much bigger fight, and Floyd was a very top-tier skilled fighter, and a dude that Shane could have potentially lost to, and why the hell would you want to take that fight for not a major payday? It's just not going to make any sense. And then later on, of course, Shane claimed that, he had a loose tooth and had to get it fixed, or something wrong with his teeth. I can't remember. Something wrong with his jaw or something. I think it was like a loose tooth, but one of y'all will have to correct me on it if I'm wrong. So once again, this narrative of that, oh, what happened to the guys that, want to fight the best? They use this narrative once again to tear down certain fighters. Now, don't get it wrong. Does that mean that that gives you the right overall to duck a certain fighter? No, not necessarily. But I can't necessarily blame Fundora for going after Errol Spence Jr. and his team. To be honest, I think that it would be the better move, at least at the moment.
And when Floyd Mayweather was 36, coincidentally the same age that Terence Crawford is today, Floyd Mayweather, he was fighting the much bigger, younger, stronger version of David Benavidez, which was Canelo Alvarez. And at age 38, Floyd Mayweather, he was fighting Manny.
Well, first of all, Canelo's not, he's not much bigger overall than David Benavidez, at least overall with the way that he put it. But I don't think Dante really meant overall like that. I think that all he was stating, of course, is that Canelo was way bigger and stronger than that of Floyd, and he was probably about 20 pounds bigger than that of Floyd Mayweather Jr. But comparing Canelo and David Benavidez, I mean, the only similarities that those two really have is that they both have somewhat of Mexican descent. That's really about it. I don't think that Canelo nor David Benavidez, I don't think that they really fight that similarly. I mean, they can both be pressure fighters, but David Benavidez, in my view, he has very poor feet. I mean, Canelo Alvarez doesn't always have the greatest of feet either, but I think that his foot positioning is at least better than David Benavidez's, at least at times. He's definitely a more skilled fighter and a better defensive fighter and a smarter fighter. Now, Benavidez, if that fight were to happen now, he might potentially beat Canelo once again because he's probably about 2 weight classes naturally bigger than Canelo Alvarez. And on top of that, Canelo, you can tell, is aging a little bit as a fighter. And of course, on top of that, David Benavidez is a decently skilled fighter. It isn't, of course, that he, even Canelo at his best, would have a problem probably with David Benavidez. But, once again, I don't really see too much similarity within their styles.
Pacquiao, who was younger than him and was considered pound for pound number 2, the best fighter in the world. Not to mention, that fight was originally supposed to happen like 5 or 6 years earlier. The reason why the fight didn't happen is because Manny Pacquiao turned down the fight because he refused to do Olympic-style random drug testing. So you can't use Floyd.
Yes, that is true. Which more than likely means that Manny Pacquiao was on something. I do believe that Manny Pacquiao probably was on steroids. Let me also tell you this. Terence Crawford right here, he's more than likely on something as well. It's very interesting that DontaesBoxingNation and a certain amount of these other guys, they don't mention anything about the snack program. The snack program, once again, is owned. And this is also another point. If these guys aren't racially motivated, why all the allegations against Tyson Fury for allegedly cheating against Deontay Wilder, or the use of steroids, and then on top of that, when it comes to certain fighters with the snack program like Crawford, Devin Haney, Shakur Stevenson, there's almost never any allegations from these guys that they're potentially on steroids. Remember when Tyson Fury was caught with Daniel Kinahan, the former Irish mobster boss and, or English mobster boss, wherever the fuck he's from, and then, they said, oh, we told you Fury's corrupt, Dante and Aki TV said that, but they didn't mention anything with Crawford being associated with him, even though he also was associated with him, and Crawford is now with Victor Conti, who is a former world-class supplier of steroids and PEDs to athletes. He was caught as one of the kingpins of providing steroids to athletes around the world, and they never mention it. Isn't that interesting? And do I believe that Crawford is on steroids? Yes. It is what it is. But like I said, I think a lot of these fighters are on steroids anyway, too. So to me, it's never really that big of a deal.
Mayweather as an example for why Sebastian Fundora is fighting the guy that just lost as opposed to fighting the guy that just beat him, which is Terence Crawford beating Errol Spence. But another example Samson used was Canelo. Now you can use a Canelo example because that is truly a Canelo Alvarez move. Now when you hear Sebastian Fundora's promoter Samson saying, fighting Crawford is not...
Well, once again, Canelo Alvarez also is a great businessman as well, and he does a lot of what Floyd Mayweather Jr. used to do in his career, which is fight fighters across the world in order to gain a bigger fan base and, throughout a multitude of countries and, demographics. But on top of that, of course, sometimes he'll wait for a fight to marinate a little bit as well, just like the Gennady Golovkin fight and potentially the David Benavidez fight.
Not going to sell 90,000 seats. Samson, he sounds just like Teofimo Lopez.
Right, but is Terence Crawford versus Sebastian Fundora going to sell 90,000 seats? I understand. Sometimes, of course, when a fighter or a promoter uses that excuse, it is a complete excuse to avoid that fighter. And I'm not stating, once again, that Fundora and his team don't look at Terence Crawford as a major threat. But I can't really, once again, to me, what a duck or a cherry pick is that, there's no better option for you to fight that guy. Like if Canelo Alvarez completely refuses to fight David Benavidez, and it's revealed overall that he completely is still refusing to fight David Benavidez, even with that, and there's no bigger payday and no fight overall that anyone else really wants to see, that in my opinion, is somewhat of a cherry pick. That's a cherry pick. All right, and I only say somewhat because Benavidez is, of course, so much bigger. But that being said, overall, Benavidez is still within that weight class. So, of course, if Canelo were to turn down that fight with the $150 million or however much he wants for that fight, it, of course, would be a cherry pick. It would have to be classified as a cherry pick. It would have to be. That would be the logical and the objective thing to state about that. But the thing is here is that Errol Spence would potentially be worth more money here, at least in terms of a Dallas showdown. So I can't really call it a major cherry pick. Now, do I believe, of course, it's as much in terms of legacy points as the Crawford fight? No. But once again, I can't blame overall them once again for going for the Errol Spence Jr. fight.
When he was trying to justify fighting against George Kambosos in Australia, that's exactly what he said. He said, why would we fight Haney when we could sell 100,000 seats in Australia fighting against George Kambosos? The reality is this situation has nothing to do with money. And it never has anything to do with money when you see a fighter turning down the tougher opposition. That's the reason.
Well, it has a lot to do with money. And at the end of the day, DontaesBoxingNation, is no offense against you, but you're not in the ring. You're not paying these guys' bills. You're not giving them money, at least mainly when it comes down to it. And on top of that, you don't really have enough boxing acumen to really break down a lot of boxing points anyway, and especially the business side of boxing. I mean, Dante can make that point about it's never about the money. How can you say that it's never about the money when, of course, in certain areas, it's going to be a difference of millions of dollars? It just is what it is. Of course, it's about the money because every time you lose a fight, or if you lose a fight, that decreases your value. That decreases your marketability. Of course, it's a lot about the money.
Why, once again, Lopez, he stood to make over $4 million to fight Haney. He turned down that fight to fight George Kambosos, and he made $1.5 million because he would rather keep winning, making less money than taking an L for one big payday. I mean, let's just be realistic.
On top of that, he also may be trying to build that fight up. But also, let me also tell you this, because that's not the worst point, at least with Teofimo Lopez. But, the thing is overall with Teofimo is that you can tell that, in my view, that he's a bit nervous every single time that Devin Haney is brought up. He hasn't really tried to make that fight when it comes down to it. He was a bit nervous about it at 135, and he also seems nervous about it at 140. Of course, that would be a great fight. That would be a mega fight, But we'll see overall, what happens with that.
Secure.
And if we're talking about a fighter, actually, that pretty much is willing to fight everybody. If I have to give someone credit here, just in terms of a fighter that is willing to pretty much fight everybody, no questions asked, no matter, a certain amount of the money or the conditions, I probably would have to give that to Devin Haney. He's probably the only fighter that I'd take a look at and say is able to do that, at least within a multitude of weight classes. Now, of course, I probably could also bring up Tyson Fury, Artur Beterbiev, those two guys as well, Dimitri Bivol. I probably could bring up those guys, but of course, those guys are only within one weight class. But of course, I can bring up those guys as well. Inoue has proved that, of course, he's willing to fight anybody, So, I mean, those fighters, and Crawford and Canelo, they're also up there. But of course, there's been certain times where, they haven't always, necessarily taken on all comers. And, in boxing, and really within your career, you probably shouldn't. Because you're going to have to do that overall with a certain amount of money and a certain amount of marketability. It's called knowing your value. Now, if you keep doing it overall once again, and there seems to be a good deal on the table and you still won't fight that guy, then yes, then criticism is going to have to come your way, But, at the end of the day, once again, I don't mind Sebastian Fundora going after Errol Spence Jr. next.
Let's be honest. If Sebastian Fundora, if he stood to make, let's say he stood to make $5 million against Crawford, and he stood to make $4 million against Errol Spence, which fight do you think he would take? He would take the Errol Spence fight for less money because he has a better chance of beating Errol Spence.
That's a part of it. And on top of that, that's going to make his marketability greater. But on top of that, when it comes down to it, the manager is correct. The Errol Spence Jr. versus Fundora fight, especially in Dallas, that would be humongous. That would be a huge, huge fight. Especially once again, because you can appease to the Mexican-American fan base and the Latino fan base down there in Texas and in Dallas. And then on top of that, you have a bunch of people who know Errol Spence Jr. and a lot of people who are going to come support their boy Errol Spence Jr. you know, when it comes down to it, because of course he's a Dallas native, you know, and then of course once again a lot of the Mexicans and Latinos are going to come support their boy Sebastian Fundora, so you can appease kind of both of those fan bases. That's why I don't really mind this fight.
His way of thinking. Guys, Virgil Ortiz was Terence Crawford's mandatory, and Virgil Ortiz, he turned down the fight. Virgil Ortiz could have easily made anywhere from $3 to $5 million fighting against Terence Crawford for a world title. Do you guys know how much Virgil Ortiz makes today? He made $300,000 in his very last fight. You know why? Because they would rather get paid less and have a guaranteed win than suffer a loss for a big payday. Unless it's some crazy payday to where they're getting paid enough to retire, like $10 or $20 million. Teofimo.
Yes, that's oftentimes how it works. You know, kind of like what Jamel Charlo took against Canelo Alvarez.
Lopez is fighting against another.
And Mikey Garcia against Errol Spence Jr. And Mikey was trying to get that retirement money against Manny Pacquiao, but the fight didn't end up coming to fruition. You know, Mikey was, I already told people this. I see Mikey Garcia retiring from a mile away. You know, people said, oh, he's going to fight Lomachenko. No, he wasn't. Mikey Garcia wasn't trying to fight no Lomachenko. Like Boxing Ego and Dante, they'll try to tell you this bullshit about how Mikey Garcia was avoided by Lomachenko. No, he wasn't. Lomachenko, once again, he called out Mikey Garcia multiple times. He turned down the fight once against Mikey because he said, I have a tore shoulder and I need one more fight to prepare. But then after the Jose Pedraza fight, I believe, he stated, okay, Mikey, where you at? And Mikey Garcia relinquished his WBC title. But there's never any talks about it. You know, and once again, I always tell people this. There's one or two reasons why they like to promote non-black fighters on these channels, on the LDBC and the media channels. Because either A, they know they're not a threat to the #1 pound-for-pound spot, and they can use them to tear down one of the guys that are, like when Lomachenko was. That's why they use Mikey Garcia's name to tear him down. You know, and then on top of that, if they think that they can use their name, you know, to uplift a black fighter on the list like Josh Taylor, because they knew damn well that he wasn't going to beat Crawford, you know, or Errol Spence Jr., you know, so they could try to propel him within their top pound-for-pound and then say that Crawford or Spence beat a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. That's pretty much one of the only two reasons why they love to do that. They won't do it for any other reason. If they believe that that fighter is a true threat within a multitude of weight classes and can be debated within, you know, 2 or 3 weight classes around them, they never debate that fighter as the #1. Not Lomachenko, not Canelo, not Inoue, not Usyk, not Fury, none of them.
Nobody in his very next fight. He would have made way more money and they would have sold way more tickets if he would have fought Keyshawn Davis. So this has nothing to do with ticket sales. This has everything to do with having a better chance of winning your very next fight.
Of course it has something to do with ticket sales, and of course it also has something to do with money. Of course it does. But it's no offense against Dante, but on top of that, he's not really the sharpest tool in the shed. It just is what it is.
I mean, if you had to fight Errol Spence or Terence Crawford next, I think all of us would pick Errol Spence, right? Because at least there's some type of blueprint of how to beat him. We've seen him get knocked out before, but there is no blueprint on how to beat Terence Crawford. Like I said, even if Sebastian Fundora was getting paid less to fight against Errol Spence, if he can beat Errol Spence, that means he lives to fight another day, which means he gets to maximize his money, just like his promoter said. But guess what? If he loses to Terence Crawford in his very next fight and gets knocked out, he most likely won't get another big payday. He'd have to work.
Absolutely, you idiot. That's exactly why Sebastian Fundora is thinking about taking the Errol Spence Jr. fight. So once again, you know, this idiot once again is claiming overall that it's not about the money. You just explained about why it's about the money, you moron. This dude.
Work his way back up the ladder. Now, this situation really has nothing.
Once again, why the fuck would you want to fight Terence Bud Crawford next from a promoter's standpoint when Terence Bud Crawford is probably not as big of a sale as Errol Spence Jr. within that of Dallas? You're gonna get potentially more money, even a decent amount more money potentially. You can really sell that fight. And then on top of that, you know, once again, Crawford's a dude that'll end your career. Once again, you know, Dante is right to say that these guys are looking at Crawford as a threat. Of course they're looking at him as a threat. But I can't blame overall Fundora for taking the Errol Spence Jr. fight when that probably makes the most logical sense in terms of a money standpoint. And also, if you beat Errol Spence Jr., it's also really going to add to your legacy. You know, so why would you want to take the Terence Bud Crawford fight right now when he's probably not the biggest sell that you could potentially have next, at least not at the moment? And then on top of that, you know, you could even add more to your legacy against Errol Spence Jr. The Errol Spence Jr. fight for him probably would make the most amount of sense.
to do with Errol Spence. It's more about Sebastian Fundora and his decision to once again fight the loser instead of fighting the winner. Now, for Errol Spence, this is great news.
And once again, Crawford's a dude that's doing the same exact shit. Like, I'm sure that he potentially could get a higher payday against Duran Butsenis. But at the end of the day, he's not fighting Duran Butsenis because he's looking at it in a very similar light. Why the fuck would I want to fight that dude right now? He's not a super established fighter. He's not going to give me a major payday. And on top of that, he's very dangerous. Why do that when I proved already everything at the welterweight class that I need to by winning all the belts there? I beat the guy that people said I needed to face for years, and that I wouldn't beat. So why the hell would I want to fight that kid right now? There's no reason for me to. So once again, if you want to claim all this stuff about, overall criticize Fundora for taking the Spence fight, and I get it to a degree, I understand. But once again, then let's keep that same energy with Crawford with Duran Butsenis. That's why I keep saying, Dante, and certain guys, it's not just them, but a lot of people always love to use this narrative about, overall, Crawford and, or this fighter is, he don't duck no smoke and all that stuff. Listen, there's no fighter on the planet that is just going to take any fight, no matter what, no matter the price. It's not going to happen.
And I'm looking forward to seeing this fight. I just think it would have made more sense for Errol Spence to fight the loser of the Sebastian Fundora-Tim Tszyu fight and have Crawford fight the winner. Because that's usually how it works in professional sports. You advance to the play.
Boxing is completely different overall than that of other sports. But Dante, once again, he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. It is what it is. He's not the sharpest tool in the drawer. Boxing is a completely different sport. All right, because when you talk about those other sports, they don't have the type of money system and the type of freedom overall within their rankings. So you have to be more smart in terms of a marketability perspective overall to match make some of these fights. And in order to make your fighter and you the most amount of money possible, So, in another sport like basketball or football, of course, that's how it works. And for sure that those two are the best of the best and they basically have no choice. But it's not always like that, overall in terms. And of course, even the NFL and the NBA, they don't always want some of these teams that end up going through to go through. Like, for those of you that remember, a lot of people talk about this series. I believe the 2002 LA Lakers versus Sacramento Kings series. Do you think that the refs wanted the Sacramento Kings to get past the LA Lakers? Of course not. And of course, a lot of people would debate that the Sacramento Kings were better than the LA Lakers. Of course, that series was probably helped out a little bit by the officials, but it is what it is. Once again, they wanted the LA Lakers to go through. The point is that you have to go according to your marketability and what sells. And in boxing overall, you have to go by that as well, especially in a sport to where your career could be ended after one fight.
Playoffs, and then you go to the Super Bowl or the finals, etc., etc. You don't get eliminated in the playoffs and then go straight to the finals, go to the gold medal match. And let me say this as well. Even though I completely debunked the whole excuse of, it's all about money and it's all about selling tickets, etc., 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 for the fans that say things like that, if you're a boxing fan, why would you even care about what fight sells the most tickets? You're not a promoter. You're not a manager. You're supposed to be a boxing fan. You're supposed to want to watch the best fight the best, unless you just don't like.
Well, in terms of a fan perspective, I think overall that a lot of people would want to see Crawford versus Errol Spence, Crawford versus Fundora, or whoever the winner of that Tszyu versus Fundora fight was. But at the end of the day, in terms of the marketing perspective, or in terms of the promoting perspective, and Fundora's perspective, I can understand why they're going after Errol Spence Jr. That's why I don't really have a problem with it. To me, a duck would be is that if Errol Spence Jr. also is clearly not going to give you a major payday, but he is.
A particular fighter, and you just don't want to see him win anymore. With that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. All right, now check this.
But anyways, that's pretty much about it. But Dante brings up some interesting points here. But if he's also going to bring this up, he also should bring up that same point with Crawford and Duran Butsenis. But you notice that he's not going to do that. But like I say, Crawford is also doing something very similar because he's not interested in fighting Duran Butsenis right now. He's not trying to make that fight. And I don't blame him. It is what it is. Because Duran Butsenis is very dangerous. And on top of that, he's not going to give you as much of a payday overall as probably what you would want. And Fundora, I think, takes a look at it as the same way as Crawford. Now, he is going to have to fight Crawford eventually. But, at the end of the day, if he takes the Spence fight first once again, I don't think that that's really a bad decision. To be honest with you, I think that would be the best decision for every party involved, even including Terence Crawford, because it would hype up that fight a little bit more. But we'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later, and we'll see where this goes.